Hello, everyone. Good day to you all, and welcome to our webinar State Transportation Electrification Strategies Best Practices. We have a great conversation lined up for you all today. Our speakers will discuss state EV deployment and adoption strategies. I am Simbiat Yusuf Miller. I am the events manager at Fourth. And before I pass it over to our moderator today, Shannon Walton-Clark, our senior policy manager at Fourth, we have a few announcements from the Fourth team. Attendees, we ask that you submit all your questions via the attendee chat. We will get through the questions during the Q&A portion of the presentation. We will also be sharing the webinar slides as well as the recording with you all shortly after the presentation today. So if you miss anything, don't worry. The recording will be shared with you and you can share it along with your network as well. And for some of you that don't know who we are at Fourth, we are Fourth. We are on a mission to electrify transportation. We bring together people to create solutions to reduce pollution and barriers to access. We do this work in 5 focus areas, which are our access to electric cars, access to charging, access to policy, access to emerging modes, and events and partnerships. With all of these methods, we hope to create a clean transportation system for everyone. If you have any questions about Fourth, our work, what the work each of these focus areas are doing, you can find that information on our website at fourthmobility.org. And we always like to take this opportunity to thank our members and sponsors who help put this program, our webinars together and support our mission at Fourth. If you have any questions about membership or supporting our webinar program, you can reach out to myself or our new partnerships and membership manager, Rachel Haverkamp. Her email is on the screen, but it will be included in the webinar recap. Sponsorship and membership opportunities are a great way to support our mission at Fourth. And we are 62 days away until Roadmap 2023. Can you imagine? We were just talking about Roadmap 2022. Instead of me telling you about Roadmap, we would like to show you all a quick video, and here it goes. I hope that video was enough to convince you all to register immediately for the Roadmap Conference. We have a great program lined up for you all, great networking opportunities, receptions, and just general connections with industry leaders. For more information, you can find that information at roadmapfourth.org. And now I will pass it along to our moderator today to introduce our speakers. Shannon?
Thank you so much, Simbi. And my name is Shannon Walton-Clark. I'm a senior policy manager here at Fourth. I am so excited to be hosting and facilitating my first webinar with Fourth. A huge thank you to our sponsors, Black and Viatech, for today's webinar. I'm going to be introducing our panelists, and as I introduce them, I invite them to come on stage and show their faces, and then we'll get started. So our first presenter today is Heather Hildebrandt, Statewide Initiatives Supervisor from North Carolina Department of Transportation. Heather has worked at the intersection of transportation and air quality. She helped develop the North Carolina Zero Emission Vehicle Plan and co-leads the planning efforts in the development of the North Carolina Clean Transportation and National Electric Vehicle, or NEVI, plans. Welcome, Heather. Our next presenter is Kyla Maki. Kyla works on renewable energy, alternative transportation, and energy efficiency planning at the state and regional levels. She has worked with the Department of Environmental Quality for 7 years. Prior to working for DEQ, Kyla worked for a statewide nonprofit clean energy policy advocacy organization. Welcome, Kyla. And last but not least, right here in our own backyard of Oregon, Amanda Pietz, the Policy Data and Analysis Division Administrator at the Oregon Department of Transportation. Amanda was the recipient of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Official President's Award for Planning and chairs the subcommittee on air quality, climate change, and energy. Prior to the Oregon Department of Transportation, Amanda was an archaeologist specializing in relationships with Northwest tribes, prehistoric sites, Victorian area accoutrements, and Easter Island archaeology. Welcome, Amanda. I think that's the first time I've gotten to say accoutrements in a professional work setting, not facetiously. So thank you all for joining us today. And how amazing is it for us in Women's History Month to have 3 women, amazing experts sharing such great best practices with all of our attendees today. So to get us started, I want to start us off with an icebreaker. And Amanda, why don't you go first? What aspect of your electrification plan are you most excited about and why?
Wow, it sounds like an interview question here. The thing I'm most excited about and why, I feel like a pageant here, is really trying to overachieve, right? There's a lot of requirements with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that are pretty strict, but we see opportunity going above and beyond those, making sure that we have uptime requirements that are higher than the federal standards set, looking for other opportunities to leverage some of those dollars, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So we always like A pluses here in Oregon. So pretty excited to go above and beyond where we can on the minimum standards and address Justice 40 and some of the other requirements as deeply as we can.
Awesome. Kyla, what about you over in Montana? What are you most excited about and why?
Yeah, I'm just really excited that we established a plan in a state that is very much a blank canvas for EV adoption and EV charging stations. Very rural state, of course. The majority of even some of our most traveled routes are primarily rural travel. So it's just exciting to develop a plan, kind of prioritize some locations, also thinking about the numerous underserved, disadvantaged communities in Montana and how to really engage with them in the planning process. But as we move forward with some of the RFP and funding opportunities, our plan kind of lays out how we're going to continue engaging with those communities.
Awesome. And Heather, what about you? What are you most excited about and why?
I think what I'm most excited about is, after being in this arena for over 25 years, that there's actually investment by the federal government in moving the dial. So, we've in North Carolina have done, projects through, trying to scrape together funding to do alternative fuels. And this has really been the Volkswagen, I think, started it in North Carolina, but this is certainly going to move us forward in a direction that I'm excited about. So, being an environmental engineer, I've been passionate about looking for alternatives to help clean up the environment in the transportation field. And it's always come down to money, and there's finally money and investment that is occurring. So that makes it exciting for me.
Awesome. Well, there's so much hope and a lot of excitement and momentum amongst all 3 of these states and amongst you. And so I'm really excited to hear more from you. And so first up, we're going to have Heather present to us a little bit about what's going on in North Carolina. I'm going to close off my camera and hand the stage over to Heather.
So good for me, afternoon. Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here virtually to speak with you about what North Carolina is doing with respect to clean transportation, and then specifically touching into how we envision deploying our NEVI funds. Okay, a little bit of lag time there, so I'll have to get used to that. So I just wanted to give you kind of a little high level view of the landscape with respect to North Carolina and what we're looking at with respect to clean transportation. So our Governor Cooper has signed into law, or not law, but has signed 3 executive orders. The first one was in 2018, which started our path towards electrification by setting economy-wide emission standards, and also set targets for zero emission vehicle registrations in North Carolina. It also directed NCDOT to develop our first zero emission vehicle plan to look at how we can, move the dial with respect to adoptions. The second order was Executive Order 246, which was in 2022. These actually strengthen the economy-wide emission standards, increase the number of zero emission vehicle registrations to 1.25 million by 2030. And then also looked to have us develop a clean transportation plan, which is what I'll touch on here in just a bit. The most recent executive order was 271, which really kind of doubled down on efforts in the medium and heavy duty arena by directing the Division of Air Quality to propose an advanced clean truck rule, and also for NCDOT to look at the ZEV infrastructure needs for both medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as obviously what we're going to be doing with NEVI for the light duty sector. So what is a clean transportation plan? So it was very important for us to realize that it was not just for NCDOT, but it was going to be a plan for North Carolina. So it is looking at not only, what we should be doing as a department, but also what others can do, because we realize it's going to be a stakeholder process. It's going to involve participation from all sectors of the state, and consider all layers of governance. And with everything that has occurred under this current climate, we also want to make sure that we are focusing in on equitable outcomes. So when we started the process, we actually looked at these 5 focus work groups. Light duty vehicles, we're going to kind of pivot off of the zero emission vehicle plan that we had already developed. Medium and heavy duty kind of pivot and built off of the medium and heavy duty MOU that North Carolina signed on to. Fleet transition was looking at the electrification of, or expanding electrification of our transit vehicles, as well as other fleets within the state. The vehicle miles traveled builds off of the VMT task force that we had already developed in North Carolina. And then finally, the clean transportation infrastructure. This kind of morphed a little bit into NEVI focus, obviously with the funding coming out shortly thereafter. But it is to actually look at all options for cleaner technology, whether it be electrification or other alternative fuels. So after those 5 work groups were created, we met 6 times over a 6-month period and developed a plethora of strategies and ideas. It represented over 3,000 comments that we kind of boiled down into these 4 main focus areas. The first one being infrastructure. Obviously, there's certain things that need to be built out to support these technologies. Funding and financing. Oftentimes it comes down to financing. How are we going to fund these initiatives? We also realized that communication and engagement was very important. Getting the word out to the public, what they can do, the benefits and disadvantages of these alternate technologies. And then also governance, what laws might be in place that need to be changed to move forward these initiatives, or what can be done with respect to governance. And this was also over the lens of understanding that it's going to be a partnership. It's going to be not just state government, it's going to be municipal government, it's going to be individuals, it's going to be for-profit individuals, it's going to be everybody coming together. And then, of course, with the lens of equity and ensuring that we look at that for all of North Carolina's residents. So I'm going to now transition a little bit into our NEVI plan. So, our plan was submitted by the deadline August 1st, And it was accepted by the Joint Office, which made available $109 million to North Carolina. Since then, we have been very busy trying to lay the groundwork and make sure that we have a successful program in North Carolina. So what are the purposes of our goals? So we want to make sure that we have easy accessibility to EV charging, that obviously we meet the requirements for reliability, that there's equitable distribution of benefits, specifically to traditionally disadvantaged communities, to help meet those Justice 40 requirements, to also expand North Carolina's economic and workforce development opportunities, and to provide reliability during an emergency event. So North Carolina, being on the eastern part of the state, obviously has issues with hurricanes and other emergency events. So we wanted to make sure that any infrastructure that we were developing was going to help support the evacuation routes in case those things were to occur. This is a map right here that shows North Carolina's alternative fuel corridors. We were one of the, we have submitted corridors from the very beginning of the program. And we actually included some additional corridors during round 6 after the program was identified, mainly to touch in on those Justice 40 communities. This is just a brief overview. So our timeline right now is we are looking to develop an RFI to get input from the industry. We are hoping to have an RFP out to be released to the public and for participants by May. That's our timeline. We're hoping to do that, but obviously we're trying to get feedback from other states to make sure that we're going to be successful right out the gate. One of the things that we thought was been really beneficial in North Carolina is we had several small stakeholder meetings throughout the state, which brought together utilities, EV equipment providers, site hosts, and also the public. And then this is just a brief overview of our procurement process. So again, we took all the feedback from the small group meetings with respect to also the RFI that we're going to be developing. To develop an RFP, we're going to select firms or multiple firms, and then obviously result in the construction. And with that, this is my contact information. I hope that if there's any questions, either today or later, if you have any questions about what North Carolina is doing, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Shannon for the next speaker.
Heather, thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about what's going on in North Carolina, and a reminder to please submit your questions through the chat. So our next presenter is Kyla from Montana. So Kyla, why don't you come on stage with me and let us know what's going on in Montana?
Great. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you for inviting me to discuss some of Montana's electric vehicle deployment strategies, in particular Montana's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment Plan, and some of the work we've done around electric vehicles and infrastructure over the last few years. So our first kind of foray into, sorry, just trying to advance the slide. Hold on one second. So our first kind of foray into electric vehicles was, of course, as many states, the Volkswagen settlement and our beneficiary mitigation plan. Montana's allocation for the settlement was $12.6 million. The funding eligible categories were primarily, of course, for medium to heavy duty diesel vehicle replacements and repowers, with 15% of our allocation, so just under $2 million, allowed to go towards electric vehicle infrastructure for light duty vehicles. So Montana developed our infrastructure or our mitigation plan. Our goals were to reduce mobile sources of NOx emission, prioritize clean transportation, vehicle replacements and infrastructure. And then also key was achieving long-term air quality benefits and public health benefits as well. And so a lot of our efforts have been geared towards where it makes sense and where they're commercially available, funding electric vehicle replacements for some of the medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as putting out funding for charging stations. We've funded several electric school buses, transit buses, street sweepers, airport support ground equipment. So quite a few electric replacement funding coming from our Volkswagen settlement. So building from that and focused a little bit more on the infrastructure side, we've also worked closely with our Department of Transportation to designate key travel corridors as electric vehicle corridors in the state. So, of course, the interstates, which are interstates 15, 90, and 94, as well as U.S. Highways 93 and U.S. Highway 2, which runs east to west across the northern portion of the state, which is a key travel corridor for rural communities in Montana, as well as people traveling from Canada. So we designated the most traveled east to west and north to south routes. That's over 2,000 miles of designated corridors, and we've been doing that since 2019 in anticipation of potential funding for the Alternative Fuel Corridor Program and for designated corridors for each state. So we also undertook or worked with a consultant, AECOM, to undergo some analysis on the electric vehicle market in Montana. We're really wondering, there hadn't been any work to date on what's the electric vehicle market in Montana, how should we prioritize locations along the alternative fuel corridors, and where should those locations be? So in 2021, we worked with AECOM to undergo some analysis that covered the scope of the market, the EV growth in Montana, projected EV growth, as well as out-of-state vehicle traffic. Tourism is an important part of Montana's economy, contributes over $5 billion annually to our economy. And so we really wanted to think about, how do we support EV drivers coming from states where EV adoption is higher, and that continues to fuel our economy through our tourism opportunities. So some of this analysis showed, you'll see that on the left, some projections on Montana's in-state EV market. Not too high. Looking at 2030 and 2040 estimates, you can see that comparing Montana's EV market to the projected out-of-state market on the right, that the out-of-state EVs will be significantly more, about 100,000 vehicles in 2030, compared to the medium case scenario in Montana, which is about 31,000 EVs coming from Montana state drivers in 2030. So this just to show that the out-of-state travel tourism is a key part of Montana's plan, and what we are planning for with regards to the NEVI funds as well. So this analysis also considered locations to meet the NEVI requirements along the alternative fuel corridors. And this shows that the locations in green where new stations would need to be to meet those 50-mile distance requirements. And you can see there's quite a few locations, quite a lot of ground to cover. The purple locations are planned locations, and then the black, which are somewhat hard to see, but there's not many of them, are the current DC fast charging locations in Montana. So along those 2,000 miles of corridors that we've designated, we've got 36 locations essentially to fund with our $43 million of NEVI funds. And then the study analysis that ACOM did also looked at how could we prioritize our investments in DC fast charging locations. And this just shows that we looked at several different criteria, the filling gaps, the traffic count in those locations, projected EV traffic counts, the route itself, whether it was an interstate or a US highway, how many amenities were nearby, which can be a challenge in some locations in Montana, the cost of the charging location, and then vulnerability index. That's really a way to look at some of those demographics around public health and underserved communities. And then whether the location was a hub, so kind of connecting to US highways or designated alternative fuel corridors. And these are just the locations in the table. These are the locations along each of the routes that they identified. Those are those 36 locations. So our state NEVI plan goals were, of course, to build out the alternative fuel corridors in Montana. Rural connectivity was critically important for our state NEVI plan. We had designated US Highway 2, I mentioned, which is a very rural route, and there's a lot of commuting that happens from rural communities. So rural connectivity was important. Of course, improving charging access for underserved communities, not just looking at the communities, but looking at the sites and making sure that local drivers had access to those charging sites. Supporting tourism along the key routes. I mentioned how important tourism is with our national parks and our recreation opportunities for EV drivers. Ensuring charging station reliability and affordability. Those are really key. The stations have to work, especially in Montana. It's not just an inconvenience. It can be a real big safety issue if the charging stations aren't working. And then, of course, affordability was key. And supporting workforce and economic development by working with our labor unions and state apprenticeship programs. Our strategies and priorities were to provide funding for the underserved rural locations, filling the 100-mile gaps along the designated corridors first, so kind of a phased approach, and then addressing the 50-mile gaps in later years. Like I said, we have a lot of ground to cover, and just focusing on those 100-mile gaps first and creating a network was key. Focusing in on locations that are hubs, connections between the corridors, and then as well as gateway communities to national parks and tourism or recreation sites. Continuing to assess nominating additional corridors as AFCs for NEVI funding. So thinking about more north-south corridors in the state, and then monitoring third-party charging station deployments, including Electrify America and Tesla, and what's happening with developments with those. And then supporting applications for community charging infrastructure grants, which I heard there's more information coming out on that today. So those provide some more flexibility for the state. And then I just did want to touch briefly on this, just shows I won't go into depth on this, but just one of the challenges that we're facing in Montana is the cost of charging due to low utilization of the charging stations. You can see that the average cost in Montana, there was a demand charge assessment study done by NASIO, and the average cost of a charging station for the 150 kilowatt per charge for low usage was $353, so just over $300. So significant costs. So we're thinking about addressing those in different ways. And then here's some challenges. And then we're thinking, on the demand charge issue of providing funding for battery storage that could address electrical capacity and some of those costs associated with those. And low utilization is another challenge. So I'll just wrap up for now, and happy to answer any questions, but thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kyla, for that update from Montana. And Simbi's bringing back my slideshow. Perfect. So again, just a reminder to submit any questions to the chat. And our last presenter, but certainly not least, is our very own Oregon Department of Transportation, Amanda Pietz. Amanda, looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us this morning.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I'm the administrator for our Policy Data and Analysis Division, which includes, I think, uniquely to our Department of Transportation, a climate office. So we have 13 folks in our climate office really dedicated at addressing climate adaptation, but also ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly an important part of that is electrifying our transportation system. So we have 4 of the 13 staff that are dedicated just towards transportation electrification. I'll get used to the lag here a little bit too. These are some of the key steps that I see that can really help enable transportation electrification overall. Really thinking about the charging infrastructure. And I have a slide that kind of walks through each of these bullets that are listed. But no matter what stage of exploration, planning, or development, the key to success is partnerships. You heard that a little bit earlier from Heather. There are many different players in electrification space. We all have to really be working together, aligning, partnering, so that we're moving in the same direction and achieving our collective goals. So one of the first steps that I see as key in moving forward with electrification is really understanding the lay of the land, understanding the pieces out there. So you've heard me say a couple times now, transportation electrification. I use that term very purposefully and not electric vehicles, because we're working towards more than just electric cars and trucks, but also electric micromobility, so bikes and scooters, and the medium and heavy duty space. So think about transit buses and freight trucks. To enable electrification, we recognize it's more than just installing the charging infrastructure itself. It's also about addressing the cost of the vehicles, sharing data and information, and really centering equity in order to address and ensure access for everyone. And that's really where partnerships come in that I was mentioning. We must all understand the pieces of the puzzle and how we fit together. So the Oregon DOT, for example, we take a lead in public charging infrastructure, while our sister agency, our Department of Environmental Quality, has incentive programs to really bring down the cost of the vehicles. And Department of Energy gathers information on the electrical grid capacity. They also have a dashboard that they provide information to the public about charging and about adoption rates. But beyond state agencies, we also have to figure out how our pieces fit with the private side and the private sector, and really what is it that we should focus on as public entities versus others. And we really help to define our roles as equity champions, really ensuring access for everyone, disseminators of information, and drivers towards key goals like emission reduction. So we, in the case of ODOT, actually, we play a lead role in also pulling all the players together and helping to create alignment between all the entities, making sure, again, we're moving kind of in that same direction. So if we pull back to one of ODOT's main roles, we lead in the electric vehicle charging infrastructure space, providing public charging infrastructure. One of the first things that we did was estimate statewide charging needs and really determine our deployment priorities. We did this through our study that we called TINA. You can see what the acronym means there on the screen. And this looked at our statewide goals for light duty electrification and really determined how much charging infrastructure is needed. The answer is a lot. It's a 5 times increase from 2020 to 2025. And TINA really helped us to determine our priorities for all aspects of electrification. So we recognize, for example, light duty vehicles, they're there today. We really need to focus our efforts to enable charging for cars and trucks. So a lot of our investments, as I'll talk about, are focused there. But also medium and heavy duty may not be far off. And we learned that it takes a long time to plan these sites, maybe 5 years or so. And we need to start partnering today with industry and utilities if we have a chance of meeting those infrastructure needs tomorrow. For micromobility, we identified the biggest barriers as the biking and walking infrastructure as opposed to the public charging infrastructure. But we also noted an opportunity to really add charging for low voltage e-bikes and scooters where we can. And all of this really comes from our TINA findings and from some subsequent research and analysis that we've conducted. So moving from the kind of study phase to the taking action, a plan really is only as good as it is funded. So we're really grateful for the federal government, for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. This really helps to provide dedicated money to each state, as you've heard from the other presenters, but also an opportunity to get more discretionary grants. Like other states, Oregon worked to complete our state plan. We have to spend the dedicated IIJA dollars, the $52 million, which is coming to Oregon for NEVI. What's exciting, though, is that in addition to that $52 million, our agency and commission really doubled down on that commitment and dedicated $100 million in the next 5 years for adding charging infrastructure overall. So it's more than just the NEVI funding in our state. But if we look at NEVI, these are kind of our north-south, east-west corridors. That's about 2/3 of that 65 million is the NEVI program. And we've partnered with our neighboring states, Washington, California, on the timing of developing out some of these routes. So for example, I-5 is early on in development so that we can easily connect that to plans in Washington State and California at the same time and really have an interconnected Pacific Coast network. So I think partnering with neighboring states is key. Like other states, we will be, we're not the ones installing, owning, or operating the infrastructure ourselves. We'll be using public-private partnership model. We've actually employed such a model for the last decade in what's known as our West Coast Electric Highways, where we have charging infrastructure along our Interstate 5, US 101, and a few other areas. We're going to use a price agreement where we have a number of pre-qualified vendors available to pull from for executing this work over the next several years. Overall, we believe we'll be able to build out all 11 corridors that you see here on this map and double the number of public fast chargers available in the state. As we make those investments, we're looking for ways to enable broader electrification. So as you heard in other presentations, NEVI is fairly prescriptive. It focuses on light vehicles, for example. However, a key step is to look for opportunities to exceed those minimum standards. Like I said, I like the A+. So thus, we're looking at many sites or locations, so not everywhere, but where we can. We want to add some low voltage chargers for electric bikes. We want to accommodate medium and heavy duty vehicles with a pull-through design, so they don't have to back up and make a 200-point turn, but really can just pull through. And also future-proof sites with additional electrical capacity and wiring, so that in the future we can add a couple 350 kilowatt chargers as well. Beyond NEVI, we're standing up a new program, the Oregon Community Charging Rebate Program. This will address our light duty charging needs beyond kind of that backbone system, those corridors that I showed, and really focus on areas where there's not enough electric vehicles today to really make it cost effective for folks to come in and install charging infrastructure. So that's really where public investments can make a difference. So this program will pay up to 75% of costs for chargers added in low-income areas, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, around multi-unit dwellings, and in rural areas. And we'll be launching this program in just a couple months. We'll also be looking for federal funding opportunities, particularly for building out our medium and heavy duty side of things, and more. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the need to, again, work together. So we're all in this together. How do we do this? So we created a one-stop shop, which is our deployment guide that really helps any entity, whether it's a tribe, city, county, private sector, that wants to put charging in the ground. And we help them to understand where are the needs, how much is it, what are the costs, and who do you need to work with to make that happen? So basically taking it all the way from concept, wires in the ground, and a functioning system. So we're pretty excited about that as well. So with that, I want to thank our electrification team at ODOT, Mary Brazel, Jillian Domidio, Jana Compton, and Brett Howe. And my contact information's there, and look forward to the question and answer. Thank you.
Amanda, thank you so much for highlighting all of the work that's happening right here in Fourth Stone backyard. And so once again, it looks like we're getting lots of questions, but please do submit your questions to the attendee chat. And I think at this time, I'm going to invite Heather and Kyla back on with me, and we'll start going through the questions that we've received. There we go. Awesome. Well, again, thank you all for presenting, and I think we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first question that came up, and Kyla, this might be a great one for you. What resources are there for very small agencies with under 20,000 in population and 2 peak hour bus with a dial-a-ride service?
That's a really good question. I think I'm not 100% sure what they're asking, but one of the things I think might be appropriate to answer this is one of the things that we have done in North Carolina that we've started as a pilot that's actually being expanded is micro mobility, micro transit, where they had a fixed route system. Where it was serving part of the area, but not the entire area, and they have expanded that. And so it is definitely a really good opportunity to look at how these, dial a ride opportunities can actually work better than fixed trans, especially for smaller population cities. If you want to look it up, it's the city of Wilson in North Carolina, but it's a great opportunity. We're, like I said, we're looking to expand that option in other parts of North Carolina, because North Carolina is, very urban in some parts and very rural in others. And so trying to figure out how we can serve all of the populations in our state can be a challenge. And looking at that as well as we move into electrification and cleaner transportation.
And I can just add to that, for me, a great resource has been, and I was just trying to find the direct link, but the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, on their resources website, for states and state plans, they have kind of a rural transportation, electrification transportation toolkit. That's been really helpful, and there's a lot of resources and a lot of links on there. Example, charging rates, example, local electrification plans. So there's a ton of resources on that. I was just trying to find the exact link, but it's on the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation's website.
That's great to hear. So, I mean, continuing on, Kyla, with you, question specific to Montana is, what criteria is Montana using to ID existing NEVI compliant stations?
So for the existing stations, for what's NEVI compliant, we don't have many. I think we at the time we submitted the plan, had 3 locations that were Electrify America locations in the western part of the state. So 2 along I-90 and then 1 on I-15 that were NEVI compliant. We had funded some locations with our Volkswagen dollars, but those were typically, we had funded 2 50 kilowatt, and many of them were actually 62 kilowatt, but 2 50 kilowatt charging stations at the locations that we funded. So that was quickly outdated, when NEVI came along and required 150. But just the criteria we were using was just the 4 by 150 kilowatt requirement from the and within 1 mile of a corridor from the FHWA.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think we use the same criteria to look across our systems. There's some areas that have some NEVI compliant stations, but it's mostly in our very urbanized areas of the state. Same kind of thing. We want the higher power chargers, the 4, all those kinds of access points. But it's key to try to leverage where we can when we have some of those already in place, so that we can get even more out on our system.
And we're doing something similar, because we were fairly proactive with our Volkswagen money in installing a lot of DC fast. So they were wrapping up their last round of DC fast right as NEVI was announced. So we have worked very closely with our Division of Air Quality, who's administering those funds, to try to ensure that, where possible, we could kind of, even though we can't promise that we're going to invest in that site location that they noticed, that we're opening that dialogue, so that way we can not be building another station 2 miles down the road to meet the NEVI requirements, that we're kind of working in concert as much as possible.
Thank you all so much. I think another question for all of you, and Amanda, I'd love for you to start, is what are the state plans for funding charging infrastructure for commercial vehicles, specifically medium and heavy duty vehicles?
Yeah, so that's one, as I mentioned, we're putting a lot into the light duty side right now, just because that's ready, it's there. there aren't as big of electrical grid capacity issues with the light duty side. Once we start getting into the medium and heavy duty side, we know we need to start partnering more with our utilities on the overall system, especially on individual sites. I've heard different estimates from like 40 to 60% of locations where we might site these will need electrical upgrades. And it's taking 18 months to 2 years sometimes to get the transformers in. So the time is now for planning. So I would say we're probably less on the investment side of the medium and heavy duty. We're more on the planning side of where do we need these locations? What do they look like? How's the market going to come online? Who needs to be there to partner? How do we start ordering those things? And then we'll be really looking at some of those federal dollars to go after to have a few sites that we can test and really build from Oregon's experience with the electric island that we have in the Portland area and try to get those in more sites across the state.
Yeah, we funded some infrastructure. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we funded some infrastructure for medium and heavy duty through our Volkswagen program, and provided 85% of the cost of the infrastructure associated with charging the buses that we've replaced and the that we've helped replace, and then the school buses as well as street sweeper and garbage trucks. So we did provide funding for that, but I agree that and we ran into demand charge issues with the medium and heavy duty sector as well. So which creates equity issues when you're talking public transit, especially. So that's definitely something working with our utilities, continue to work with our utilities on the medium and heavy duty.
And I would echo a lot what Kyla said in North Carolina. We've invested thus far primarily in the medium heavy duty sector in our transit electrification. So we've used both Volkswagen money, CMAQ money, as well as we expect to be using CRP money as well to help move forward those initiatives. But as I touched on, earlier during my presentation, we're also developing right now a medium and heavy duty needs assessment. So in planning for our NEVI funds, we are already thinking, similar to what Amanda was touching on, as to what the next step is going to be. So we expect the first 2.5 years, about half the funding is going to be required to build out our NEVI corridors or our alternative fuel corridors to the NEVI standard. And so we're already thinking about what does the next step look like. And to do that, we're going to look at the needs assessment. So, whether that be hydrogen or whether that be electric, it really depends on the needs case. So we are looking at the different types of, whether it's a hub, long haul, there's medium and heavy duty is a whole lot more complicated than light duty for sure. There's a lot of things to consider.
Absolutely. And kind of speaking about the whole system, Heather, why don't you start us off for this? So this question is, how can the transportation and electrification strategy approach be done in a way that it's a win for low income and marginalized communities for whom a personal electric vehicle may be out of reach for years? Do you look at broader electric transit as part of the transportation electrification strategy, rural vehicle shares, other opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, that's, like I said, equity is a huge concern in North Carolina because of, like I said, we're a wide state with very what we call the metropolitan crescent, and then a whole lot of rural. And so what electrification looks like in those more rural disadvantaged communities is much different. So one of the approaches that we really want to that we're trying to promote is the idea of community-based charging, specifically focused around our community colleges, because often we have a community college in pretty much every single county in North Carolina. And that would help with workforce development, also giving the opportunity for people to have charging that's available and accessible to the community, where they can start considering putting in electric or purchasing electric vehicles, putting it in for the municipal fleets and things like that. So we are partnering with these communities. There's a lot of interest, surprisingly, from these more rural areas with the carbon reduction program funding in putting in electric charging. And so, again, it's educating them on the applications, making them aware of the funding opportunities to bring down the cost, and then also supporting as much as possible that secondary market for electric vehicles. A lot of people, can't afford to buy, a Tesla, new. I can't afford to buy a Tesla new. But, if we can, invest in the secondary market and bringing in, the reliability and bringing down the costs, that's what's, going to be important to help drive that into those communities.
Amanda, some thoughts from Oregon on that question?
Yes. So from an infrastructure perspective, I think there's certainly opportunities within the NEVI program. We'll look for that as we do our price agreement, which basically allows a number of different firms to be available and accessible to do work as part of that NEVI funding and to receive dollars. So we're doing a pretty heavy push towards women-owned, minority businesses, and others to really diversify the workforce that we have and not just have the big and heavy hitters in there. From the kind of benefits to community side, we've had a number of regional workshops that we ran in this last month to really hear from community members, from community-based organizations on what are their needs and how do we really try to meet those within the NEVI requirements. So we're going to try to tailor based on some of the things that we heard there as well. And I think importantly, we also recognize that the NEVI program can only stretch so far in truly benefiting these communities, which is why we have that community charging rebate program that I mentioned that will launch in June. And I think the opportunity there is really around multi-unit dwellings in particular, and addressing some of those areas. The city of Portland just is now allowing charging on like lamp posts and things like that. So I think that opening of the code requirement in addition to this funding coming in are a beautiful marriage that we can provide infrastructure in areas to really reach all communities, whether there's a lot of EVs there today or whether we want to enable those tomorrow.
And Kyla, for you, what are some thoughts that you might have from Montana?
Yeah, I think I just echo a lot of what Heather and Amanda said, just to add maybe a little bit more rural flavor to that. Looking at other funding opportunities, we don't have any state funding dedicated towards EVs or infrastructure. So it really is limited to the federal funding and the Volkswagen funding to some extent. But looking for those other additional opportunities like the Community Fueling and Infrastructure Grant Program that will be announced on that funding opportunity and how to be creative for locations that are off corridors potentially, looking at some focusing charging on some transportation hubs, so where there may be bus stops or existing transportation infrastructure that serves underserved populations. Also looking at multi-unit housing. There's more and more multi-unit housing developments in the state where we have a pretty big housing crisis right now. And so thinking about some of those new developments and putting in EV infrastructure early on, maybe partnering with rideshare programs. So I think the sky's kind of the limit, and maybe the funding opportunities are really the limit here, but really exploring all options, just because access to charging and vehicles is really a challenge here.
Absolutely. And to Amanda's kind of couple of points, Fourth is a partner on the ODOT Community Charging Rebate Program. And we also provided testimony on the City of Portland's decision to open up charging. So we're happy to see those things happening here. And we're also happy to kind of hope that those ideas help to percolate outside of just here in Oregon. Simbi's telling me we've got time for a couple more questions. So one, and Heather, maybe you can start us off, is I've heard of concerns associated with entities providing power being concerned in rural areas with having the capacity to support chargers. Have you encountered any of these issues? If so, have you identified any creative solutions?
I mean, certainly there are issues with the power sector and the ability or the availability of power in the rural parts of the state. And that's something that we are, I think the biggest thing I could say is that I don't know if there's any creative solutions other than talk to your energy providers early and often. Make sure that they're aware of what's coming. I don't know if we've got several, major, energy providers in North Carolina, but we also have a plethora of co-ops and municipal electric providers as well. So making and the opportunities for each of those is different, and so you just need to make sure that you have those conversations and those dialogues open, because it's going to be a big demand on the utilities to provide the power for these, especially if we are looking at covering the entire state for light duty. That's one part of the issue. Expanding it to the medium and heavy duty is a whole nother ball of wax. So we definitely need to have those discussions.
Absolutely. And I think I'm gonna shuffle us along to our absolute last question. And thank you everyone who submitted. I know we couldn't get to all of them. But I think it's fitting for us to kind of end on this question. What would you say to the states that are looking to create their own transportation electrification plans? And Kyla, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I would say that putting some time into doing some stakeholder and impacted entities and organization mapping will pay huge dividends down the road. So really thinking through who all this plan will touch and impact, and thinking outside the box. I mean, of course, we all think of utilities, which are really key, transportation planners, local governments, but even thinking beyond that, because transportation is probably the most important aspect of people being able to commute to work, and access to jobs, and that's just it impacts everybody. And so really taking the time to do that mapping, and who's going to do the outreach and how you're going to do the outreach is really key.
Well, I feel like Kayla just nailed that question. So I don't know that I have a lot to add other than just reemphasize, I think, develop the partnerships early. Utilities are key partners, your state agencies, you have a DOT and DEQ on this call, enlist your departments of energy, public utility commissions, and more. So figure out ways to work together. Again, understanding your role, because I think any state will be fairly limited on where they can make investments. Define where it is that those investments can best achieve the outcomes you're trying to achieve with everything else that's out there.
Yeah, and going last, it always is a little bit harder. I think the only thing that I would add to what Amanda and Kyla said is the education and outreach to the community is a part that cannot be said enough. I mean, you got to do it early and often. You got to explain to them the benefits, the disadvantages. Again, being from the arena of alternative fuels in general, electrification is what we're talking about here today. This is what the funding is about right now, but there are other options. So if you're talking about decarbonation of the transportation sector, make sure that they are not looking at a solution that's not going to benefit them, because there's nothing worse than trying a new technology and it failing, because then it's gonna put you back, not just one project, but many, many years, and trying to get them to try something again. So education, outreach, benefits of all lower carbon fuels, cleaner technologies. My group fortunately handles a lot of these nice initiatives that are fun and exciting, but realizing that there's not one silver bullet, that we need to consider all options when we are talking about cleaner transportation.
Well, outreach and education is are some of our favorite words here. And in typical policy and political fashion, Simbi, I've gone over my time, but I want to give a huge round of applause virtually and a thank you to Heather, Amanda, and Kyla. Again, how lucky are we in Women's History Month to have three amazing women leaders and experts sharing their thoughts with us this morning. So Simbi, turning it back over to you with an apologies from policy for going over our time.
Not a problem. Thank you, Shannon, for leading the panel. And again, thank you, Heather, Amanda, and Kyla. We know we did not get through all of the questions, but there will be an opportunity after the webinar. We will be sending the webinar recap. You can find the contact information for our speakers here today. And we also can't finish this webinar without thanking our sponsor today, Black and Beach. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope we see you on Tuesday, April 11th for the next webinar, EV Charging at Multifamily Housing and Workplaces, where our speakers will discuss funding opportunities, best practices, and lessons learned from employers, building owners, and apartment building managers who are interested in providing charging for tenants as well as their employees. We hope to see you then. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday and a great rest of your week. Thank you all. Have a great day.